I found out my fiancé controls me the same way you train a dog. And the worst part is I'd been sitting, rolling over and playing dead for 2.5 years without even knowing there was a leash. My name's Brett Coleman. I'm 34. I sell commercial insurance in Phoenix, and until last Tuesday, I thought my relationship with Chloe was solid. Maybe a little routine, but aren't all relationships after a few years? I'd wake up, go to work, come home, watch Netflix with her, go to bed, repeat. Nothing exciting, nothing terrible, just normal engaged life where sometimes she's in a good mood and sometimes she's not. And I figured that's just how women are, right? Wrong, so incredibly wrong. It was a Tuesday evening around 7, and I pulled into our apartment complex after meeting with a restaurant owner who wouldn't stop complaining about his liability premiums. The Henderson account had been dragging for weeks, and I knew my sales numbers were slipping. I'd been distracted lately, constantly anxious about something I couldn't quite put my finger on. My performance reviews had mentioned focus issues, and there was talk of promoting someone else to senior agent, a position I'd been eyeing for 2 years. I grabbed my laptop bag and walked through our front door, immediately hearing Chloe laughing in the living room. That specific kind of laugh that's way too loud and unfiltered. The kind she only does with her girlfriends. She was on speakerphone, and I could hear at least 2 other voices cackling along with her. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was literally just standing there in the kitchen pulling a beer from the fridge, thinking about how I needed to close that Henderson deal to salvage my quarterly numbers. But then Nicole's voice cut through and said, "So, how do you keep Brett so well behaved?" And the room went quiet for half a second before Chloe said, "I control him with one thing." And all 3 of them burst out laughing like she'd just told the funniest joke in the world. I froze with the fridge door still open, cold air hitting my face. The beer bottle felt heavy in my hand, and I heard Ashley say, "Oh my God, same. Brandon thinks he's so independent, but the second I go cold for a few days, he's like a puppy." And they all laughed again. Chloe said something about how men are simple, how they'll do basically anything if you just use intimacy as leverage. And Nicole added that her husband stopped going to poker night with his buddies after she gave him the silent treatment for a week. They were trading tactics like football coaches, comparing playbooks. One of them mentioned using the tired excuse strategically. Another talked about how going to bed early without saying goodnight makes them panic. And Chloe, my fiancée, the woman I'd been with for 2.5 years and planning to marry in 3 months, agreed with all of it like she was sitting in on some masterclass about relationship manipulation. I quietly stepped back outside and sat in my car with the door closed, engine off, just staring at the steering wheel trying to process what I just heard. My hands were shaking, not from anger exactly, more from this creeping realization that was spreading through my chest like cold water. The $25,000 wedding we'd been planning, the stress of saving for a house down payment, the constant worry about whether I was making her happy, it all suddenly felt different. Hollow. I started rewinding through our entire relationship in my head, and suddenly, every confusing moment made perfect sense. 8 months ago, right after we got engaged, I'd planned a weekend fishing trip with my brother Chase, something we'd been talking about for years. Chloe said she was fine with it, told me to have fun, seemed totally supportive. But the week before the trip, she got distant, stopped initiating any physical contact, started giving me one-word answers, and when I asked what was wrong, she'd just shrug and say nothing was wrong. By Thursday, I was so anxious about whatever I'd done that I canceled the trip, told Chase something came up with work, and suddenly Chloe was warm again, affectionate, everything back to normal. I thought I'd dodged some bullet I didn't even see coming. But no, I'd just been trained. Or 4 months ago, when I started staying late at the office twice a week, trying to close a big commercial property account that would have earned me a solid commission and boosted my chances for that senior agent position. Nothing crazy, just until 8 instead of 6. Chloe didn't say anything directly, but she went ice cold, started sleeping on her side of the bed, facing away from me, stopped asking about my day, and when I tried to talk about it, she'd brush me off completely. I spent the next week trying to fix whatever I'd broken, bought her flowers, suggested date nights, apologized for working late, even though she'd never actually said it bothered her. Eventually, she thawed out. I thought we just had a rough patch, the kind all couples go through, but it wasn't a patch. It was a pattern. The worst part was realizing how it affected my work. My performance had been slipping because I was constantly distracted, constantly anxious about whatever I might be doing wrong at home. I'd gained about 15 pounds from stress eating, wasn't sleeping well, and had started avoiding after-work events because I was afraid Chloe would be upset if I came home later than expected. I'd even turned down invitations to watch games with my coworkers, gradually isolating myself from the few friendships I'd maintained after my divorce 3 years ago. My ex-wife had been controlling too, but in an obvious way with screaming and ultimatums. This was different, subtle, almost invisible until you saw it from the outside. The sales team used to grab drinks every Friday after work. I used to play basketball with guys from the office twice a week at the community center. But slowly, subtly, Chloe would make comments about how I was never home, how she barely saw me, how it would be nice if we had morning coffee together. And like an idiot, I'd adjusted. I'd stopped going, told myself it was about being a good partner, about prioritizing our relationship. But really, it was about keeping her happy so she wouldn't withdraw. I sat in that car for almost 30 minutes, just connecting dots I should have seen years ago. Every time we had a disagreement, even small stuff like where to eat dinner or which show to watch, if I didn't immediately agree with her choice, she'd withdraw. Not dramatically, not with yelling or slamming doors, just this quiet, calculated distance that made me feel like I was constantly failing some test I didn't know I was taking. And intimacy, something that's supposed to be about connection and mutual desire, had become this weird reward system where I had to earn it by being agreeable, available, and obedient. If I was a good fiancé by her standards, I got warmth and affection. If I stepped out of line, even accidentally, I got coldness and rejection. The insane part? I'd been blaming myself the entire time, thinking I was just bad at understanding her needs, bad at being a partner, bad at reading the room, all while planning a $25,000 wedding that was putting financial stress on both of us, stress that she somehow managed to weaponize too. Every time we looked at venues or talked about the guest list, any hesitation on my part about the cost would trigger the same pattern. Distance, coldness, until I agreed to whatever she wanted. I finally went inside and Chloe was in the kitchen loading the dishwasher, completely normal, humming some song. When she saw me, she smiled and asked how my day was. I said it was fine. She said dinner was in the fridge if I was hungry. And we just existed in the same space like nothing had happened because, from her perspective, nothing had. She didn't know I'd hurt her. She didn't know the entire foundation of our relationship had just cracked open in my head. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just lay there staring at the ceiling while Chloe slept peacefully next to me, occasionally shifting in her sleep and brushing against my arm. Each touch felt different now, like I was seeing our entire relationship through a new lens. And I realized I wasn't angry. I was something worse. I was clear. For 2.5 years, I'd been living in this fog of confusion, constantly trying to decode her moods, constantly adjusting my behavior to avoid her coldness, constantly feeling like I was one wrong move away from being shut out. But it wasn't random. It wasn't my fault. It was deliberate. She'd been using emotional distance as a tool to shape my behavior, and it had worked perfectly because I'd never questioned it. I thought that's what compromise looked like. That's what keeping your fiancé happy meant. That's how you maintain a peaceful home. But this wasn't peace. It was surrender. The scariest part wasn't what she'd been doing. It was that she probably didn't even think it was wrong. She learned this from somewhere. Probably her mom, definitely her friends. Maybe every piece of advice that treats men like simple creatures who need to be managed, rather than partners who deserve respect. I thought about my first marriage, how different it had been. Jennifer had been controlling too, but in an obvious way. Screaming matches, ultimatums, threats to leave. At least with her, I knew I was in a fight. This was different. This was psychological warfare disguised as normal relationship dynamics. And I started thinking about what would happen if I just stopped playing along. What if I stopped shrinking myself to avoid her moods? What if I stopped treating her coldness like something I needed to fix? What if I just existed as myself and let the chips fall wherever they wanted? The thought was absolutely terrifying because I knew it would either wake her up or end us. And for the first time in 2.5 years, I was okay with either outcome. I stopped playing the game on a Wednesday morning. And the weirdest part wasn't how hard it was how easy it felt once I decided the rules didn't apply to me anymore. I woke up that day and realized I'd spent 2.5 years walking on eggshells in my own home. And I was done. Not angry done, not dramatic done, just quietly, permanently done with the entire system. Chloe was already downstairs making coffee, probably expecting me to come down and do our normal routine where I'd gauge her mood and adjust accordingly. But instead, I got dressed, grabbed my gym bag that had been sitting unused in the closet for 8 months, and walked right past the kitchen to my car. She called after me asking where I was going, and I just said I was hitting the gym before work. And the look on her face was like I just announced I was moving to Alaska. See, one of the first things to go when her control system started working was my personal routine. I used to play basketball with guys from work twice a week at the community center near the office. I'd been doing it for 3 years, since right after my divorce, and it was one of the few things that kept me sane during that period. But slowly, subtly, Chloe had made comments about how I was never home, how she barely saw me, how it would be nice if we had morning coffee together instead of me rushing off to exercise. And like an idiot, I'd adjusted. I'd stopped going, told myself it was about being a good partner, about prioritizing our relationship. Really, it was about keeping her happy so she wouldn't withdraw. Well, not anymore. I joined a gym near my office, signed up for a 6-month membership that cost me $240 up front, money I really couldn't afford with the wedding expenses looming. But it felt like the most important investment I'd made in years. I started going every morning before work, and for the first time in months, I began sleeping better. The physical exhaustion helped quiet the constant anxiety that had been eating at me. Chloe tried her usual moves immediately. The first few days, she went cold, gave me short answers, went to bed early without saying goodnight, the whole playbook. And I just let her. I'd come home from work, sometimes grab dinner on the way if she hadn't cooked, watch whatever I wanted on TV, go to bed when I was tired. If she wanted to pout about it, that was her choice. The silent treatment only works if the other person is desperate to break it. And I wasn't desperate anymore. I was free. By the second week, she switched tactics because the cold approach clearly wasn't working. Suddenly, she was super interested in my day, asking questions about work that she'd never cared about before. She wanted to know about my clients, my sales numbers, whether I was still hoping for that promotion. She started suggesting we watch my favorite shows, being physically affectionate in this obvious, calculated way that would have worked on me a month ago. She'd touch my arm while we talked, laugh at things I said that weren't even funny, suggest we have a nice evening together with meaning in her eyes. And I was polite. I was kind. But I didn't take the bait. I wasn't being mean. I was just being honest. And honesty in a dishonest system feels like cruelty to the person who built the system. The real shift happened about 3 weeks in when I told her I was meeting Chase for drinks on Friday night, the same brother whose fishing trip I'd canceled 8 months ago. Chase had been reaching out more lately, probably sensing something was off, and I realized how much I'd missed our relationship. I didn't ask Chloe's permission. I didn't check if she had other plans for us. I just informed her the way you tell your roommate you won't be home for dinner. She got this look on her face, confusion mixed with panic, and she said, "Oh, I thought maybe we could work on the wedding planning this weekend. We still need to finalize the catering menu." Her voice had that slight edge that used to make me immediately backtrack and apologize. Instead, I just said we could work on it Saturday and went back to reading my book. And I swear I could feel the entire power dynamic in our relationship crack like ice on a frozen lake. She tried to start a fight that night, asked why I was being so distant lately, why I didn't seem interested in spending time with her anymore, why I wasn't excited about the wedding. The wedding question hit different now that I understood what it really represented. Not just a celebration of our love, but the final lock on a cage I'd been building around myself. And I could have gone nuclear and told her exactly what I'd heard, exactly what I knew, but I didn't. I just looked at her and said, "I'm not distant, I'm just not asking for permission to exist anymore," and walked upstairs. That one sentence landed differently than anything I'd ever said to her before because it wasn't angry, it wasn't accusatory, it was just factual. I wasn't playing defense, I wasn't trying to fix things, I was just stating reality. Here's what nobody tells you about setting boundaries with someone who's been controlling you. They don't just give up. They cycle through every tool they have trying to find the one that still works. Over the next month, Chloe went from cold to sweet to angry to confused to hurt, sometimes all in the same day. She'd accuse me of having an affair because apparently the only reason a man would stop being controllable is if he's getting his needs met somewhere else. She'd cry and say she felt like she was losing me, which was interesting because she never seemed worried about losing me when she was the one creating distance. She started weaponizing the wedding planning in ways I hadn't even anticipated. When I wouldn't immediately agree to upgrade the reception venue, she'd withdraw physically and emotionally until I felt like I had to choose between my financial sanity and her affection. When I suggested we could save money by having a smaller guest list, she'd get quiet and distant, making me feel like I didn't want to celebrate our love properly. The worst manipulation came when we were discussing the honeymoon. I'd suggested a long weekend in Colorado, something we could afford without going into debt. But Chloe had her heart set on 2 weeks in Europe, a $12,000 trip that would max out my credit cards. When I tried to discuss the financial reality, she went ice cold and said, "I thought this was supposed to be the most important day of our lives." The guilt was immediate and crushing. Here I was, supposedly the man who was going to take care of her, provide for her, and I was nickel and diming our honeymoon. At least, that's how she made it feel. But now I could see it for what it was. Another test. Another way to measure my compliance. And through all of it, I stayed consistent. I wasn't cruel, I wasn't playing games, I was just being myself. I went to the gym, I saw my friends. I worked late when I needed to without apologizing for it. I made plans without asking permission. My work performance started improving almost immediately. The constant underlying anxiety that had been sabotaging my focus began to fade. I closed the Henderson account in my 4th week of gym membership, and my sales manager mentioned that I seemed sharper lately, more confident in client meetings, less distracted during presentations. For the first time in months, I could see a clear path to that senior agent promotion. My numbers were climbing, I was building better relationships with clients, and I wasn't constantly checking my phone during meetings to see if Chloe had texted something that would require immediate damage control. The physical changes were noticeable too. I'd lost 8 of the 15 pounds I'd gained, my sleep had improved dramatically, and I had energy again. Real energy, not the artificial kind that comes from constantly being on edge. I started sleeping through the night instead of waking up at 3 a.m. with anxiety about what I might have done wrong. The weirdest part was how calm I felt through all of Chloe's emotional cycling. For 2.5 years, I'd been anxious constantly, always waiting for the other shoe to drop, always wondering what I'd done wrong, always trying to fix problems I didn't create. But once I stopped playing, once I accepted that our relationship might actually end and I'd be okay with that, the anxiety disappeared. I wasn't scared of her coldness anymore because I discovered something she didn't know yet. Her power over me only existed because I'd given it to her, and I'd just taken it back. About 6 weeks into this new reality, Chloe finally broke. We were sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning. She was picking at her eggs Benedict, not really eating, and the silence had stretched for almost 10 minutes. Finally, she looked at me and said, "Why are you doing this?" And I knew exactly what she meant. She meant, why wasn't I playing anymore? Why wasn't I chasing her? Why wasn't I being the manageable fiancé she'd spent 2.5 years training? Why wasn't I worried about the wedding, about making her happy, about keeping our relationship smooth and conflict-free? And I looked right at her and said, "Because I'd rather be alone than be controlled." And I meant every word. That sentence hung in the air between us like smoke, and for the first time since I'd overheard that phone call, I saw something in her face that looked like actual fear, not the manipulative kind she'd used when she wanted sympathy or attention, the real kind, because she was finally realizing the game was over and she didn't know what came next. The next morning, she didn't try any of her usual tactics. She just sat across from me at breakfast looking exhausted and said she wanted to talk, really talk. Not the surface-level stuff we'd been doing for weeks. I told her I was listening. She asked me point blank if I wanted to call off the wedding. The question hit me like ice water. 3 months ago, the thought would have sent me into a panic. The deposits we'd lose, the embarrassment, the questions from family and friends, the assumption that I'd failed again at marriage before I'd even gotten to the altar. But sitting there, looking at her across our kitchen table, I realized the panic wasn't coming. Instead, There was just this calm clarity. I took a long breath and said no. I didn't want to call off the wedding, but I also didn't want what we'd had for the past 2.5 years. I told her I wanted a partnership where respect wasn't conditional, where intimacy wasn't currency, where we made decisions together instead of her using distance to get her way. I told her I wanted to be excited about our wedding again, not stressed about whether every decision I made would trigger another round of emotional manipulation. I wanted to plan a honeymoon together, not feel guilty for having financial boundaries. I wanted to come home from work and not immediately scan her mood to determine how I needed to behave. And then I said the most important thing I'd ever said to her. I said, if the game comes back, I'm gone. Not as a threat, just as reality. She didn't get defensive like I expected. She just started crying. Not the manipulative crying I'd seen before when she wanted to change the subject or make me feel guilty for bringing up a problem. This was different. Raw. The kind that comes from actual recognition of something you've been avoiding. She said she didn't even realize she was doing it, that her mom had always treated her dad that way, that her friends all operated the same way, that she genuinely thought this was just how you maintain power in a relationship so you didn't get walked all over. I asked her if she thought I'd been walking all over her before she started the control system.